On the surface, Glenn Stearns had conquered life. Private jets, luxury yachts, sprawling estates. He had them all. The world saw a billionaire, a man who had risen through the ranks and made it to the mountaintop of the American dream. He was living proof that anything was possible with grit and ambition. But beneath the tailored suits and success was a restlessness that wouldn't go away. Glenn hadn't forgotten where he came from. Born into a working-class family, diagnosed with dyslexia, and held back in the 4th grade, he'd spent most of his early life being told what he couldn't do. Success didn't come easy. It came after years of struggle, setbacks, and relentless hustle. He had built a mortgage empire in his 20s and climbed his way to the top. But now, decades later, as he stared out the window of a luxury jet cutting across the clouds, he was haunted by a question. Was it all just luck? Was his rise a perfect storm of timing, opportunity, and chance? Or did he have something real inside him, a set of instincts, tools, and beliefs that could work under any condition? He needed to know. Not for the cameras, not for his critics, for himself. So when a television producer from the Discovery Channel pitched an outrageous idea, Glenn didn't flinch. In fact, he leaned in. The challenge was simple in theory, impossible in practice. Walk away from everything: money, contacts, comfort, and try to rebuild his fortune in total anonymity. No name, no connections, no resources. Just $100 in his pocket, an old truck, and 90 days to build a brand new business from the ground up. If he failed, he'd be forced to admit that his success had been circumstantial. But if he succeeded, he didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to, because Glenn Stearns had already made up his mind. He was about to vanish from his world of wealth and drop into a forgotten corner of America with nothing but his experience and a camera crew sworn to secrecy. Not even his family knew the full extent of what he was planning. This wasn't just a business experiment. It was personal. Glenn looked down at the faded jeans and discount hoodie he'd pulled on that morning. The first layers of a disguise he would soon be living in. No one was going to recognize him. That was the point. He stepped off the jet, tossed his phone into a sealed envelope, and climbed into the dusty old pickup truck, parked alone on the tarmac. No GPS, no road map, no safety net. Just a billionaire pretending to be poor, ready to find out if the dream that made him could be built all over again. The jet disappeared into the sky behind him, but Glenn didn't look back. He was standing in a nearly empty parking lot in the outskirts of Erie, Pennsylvania, clutching a duffel bag with one pair of clothes, $100 in cash, and a set of keys to an ancient, rusty blue pickup truck that looked like it had been built in another era. Gone were the designer watches, the well-cut blazers, the phone buzzing with investor meetings. In their place, a beat-up flannel shirt, a prepaid flip phone, and a name that wasn't his. Glenn Bryant, he said aloud as he looked at his reflection in the cracked side mirror of the truck. That was who he would be for the next 90 days. Just another middle-aged man looking for a fresh start in a struggling town. The city of Erie was a far cry from the boardrooms and beachfront properties Glenn was used to. Once a proud manufacturing hub, it now carried the faded scars of economic decline. Abandoned storefronts lined Main Street. Help-wanted signs were scarce, and hope felt in short supply. But Glenn saw something else, a challenge worthy of every drop of grit he had left. The rules were simple. Start with $100. No connections, no status. Build $1 million business in 90 days. If he failed, he'd inject $1 million of his own money into the local economy. That was the deal. But there was something more haunting than losing money. The possibility that he'd fail not because the odds were bad, but because maybe, deep down, he'd lost his edge. The pickup truck sputtered to life with a groan. Glenn pulled out of the lot and drove without a destination. The camera crew trailed quietly in another vehicle, capturing every moment of his transformation. Glenn had agreed to let them film it all under the ruse of documenting a small business startup story. Nobody in Erie knew his face. Nobody recognized his voice. For the first time in decades, he was anonymous. By sundown, he had yet to find a place to sleep. Motels were out of the question, too expensive. So he parked the truck behind a shuttered gas station, pulled an old blanket from the back, and curled up in the cab. The temperature dropped quickly, the glass windows frosting from the inside. He wore every layer he had, but the cold still crept in. That night, sleep didn't come easy. His back ached against the hard seat. His mind wandered to the soft bed waiting for him 1,000 miles away, but he wouldn't let himself miss it. He wasn't a billionaire tonight. He was a broke stranger in a town that didn't care who he used to be. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked. A train horn echoed in the distance. And inside that cab, Glenn lay in silence, staring at the roof, his breath visible in the freezing air. A man trying to remember what it felt like to have nothing. He had 89 days left, and nothing, absolutely nothing, was going to be handed to him. The cold had teeth. Glenn Stearns woke up in the driver's seat of his pickup truck, his breath clouding the air like smoke in the morning frost. His bones ached from sleeping curled in the cab for the third night in a row. The faded blanket he used might as well have been paper in the February chill. He reached for a half-drunk bottle of water on the floorboard. It was frozen solid. This wasn't just uncomfortable anymore. It was dangerous. The first week in Erie had chipped away at his ego. The second began stripping down his strength. His meals had been reduced to discount ramen and vending machine leftovers. His grooming routine depended on fast food bathrooms and gas station mirrors. One night, he'd even done his laundry in the icy river, scrubbing socks and shirts while laughing to himself. Even billionaires have to do the dirty work. But the laughter didn't last. Because this was starting to feel less like an experiment and more like survival. To stretch the $100 he'd arrived with, Glenn took on any job he could find. He scanned Craigslist every morning for odd gigs, hauling scrap, moving furniture, scrubbing bathrooms. Once, he shoveled manure on a snow-covered farm just for a few bucks and a ham sandwich. And when no jobs appeared, he drove through alleys hunting for anything recyclable, praying he could flip scrap metal into gas money. Still, it wasn't enough. One evening, after a long day spent dragging rusted car parts across an auto yard, Glenn stumbled into the truck and felt something twist in his gut. At first, he thought it was hunger. Then the nausea hit, a slow, brutal wave that climbed up his spine and stole the color from his face. Within minutes, he was doubled over in the truck, vomiting into a plastic bag, trembling with chills. Sweat dripped down his brow despite the cold. For the first time since the journey began, fear took over. He was miles from help. He had no health insurance, no emergency contact, just a cheap phone, a few crumpled bills, and a promise to himself that he wouldn't give up. But what do you do when your own body starts to betray you? By sunrise, too weak to deny it, Glenn dragged himself to a local walk-in clinic. He shuffled into the waiting room like a ghost, hoping to blend in. The receptionist didn't recognize him as a billionaire. She saw a sick, broke man. That was exactly what he was. When the nurse finally called him in, Glenn learned what so many Americans already know, that even the smallest trip to the doctor could cost a fortune. The bill, $250. It was nearly everything he had. As he slid the cash across the counter, Glenn felt something break. Not in anger, in clarity. This was the real world, not the world of corner offices and catered meetings. This was the America millions lived in, where one unexpected illness could erase your entire savings, where choosing between medicine and rent was normal. He had lived in comfort for years. But now, for the first time in decades, Glenn Stearns understood what it meant to feel powerless. He went back to his truck that night, quieter, slower, different. The cold didn't sting the same way. Not because it hurt less, but because something inside him had changed. He wasn't just pretending anymore. He was living as a poor man. And the weight of that truth was heavier than he expected. But that night, wrapped in a thrift store blanket and recovering from illness, Glenn remembered his reason for being here. This wasn't punishment. This was proof. If the dream worked once, it could work again. He closed his eyes. There were 80 days left. And now, he knew what was really at stake. Glenn Stearns was back on his feet. His body had recovered from the sickness, but something deeper had shifted inside him. The illusion of control that wealth provided, gone. Now every breath felt earned, every dollar sacred, and every minute a chance to climb. He no longer saw the experiment as a camera-laced game. He saw it as war. The mission was clear: get money, grow it, use it wisely. The truck's engine coughed to life as Glenn pulled out onto the icy street, already mentally sorting through his to-do list. He had $53 to his name. That wouldn't last a week, not with gas, food, and winter creeping in. He couldn't afford to wait for opportunity to knock. He'd have to chase it down. So he hustled. He scoured Craigslist every morning. Jobs most wouldn't look twice at. He ran toward them. Cleaning public toilets in a mechanic shop? Done. Shoveling horse manure for hours at a farm outside town? No problem. He haggled over broken chairs at garage sales and flipped them the next day for $10 profit. He negotiated, bartered, and pitched ideas to strangers in parking lots. Every single dollar mattered. Glenn's hands became calloused, his jeans stained with oil and dirt. But he welcomed the grime. It was proof he was moving. Slowly but surely, $53 became $104. Then $184. Then $300. It was still crumbs in the bigger picture, but progress was a powerful thing. Each little win wasn't just about money. It was about momentum and belief. Glenn knew one thing better than anyone else. Business isn't built on capital alone. It's built on leverage, on people, on relationships. So once he had enough money to breathe, he changed tactics. He started introducing himself around Erie, not as a billionaire, not even as an entrepreneur, just a man with a dream and some fight in him. He showed up at local meetups, popped into hardware stores and asked about abandoned properties. He bought coffee for anyone who'd talk about the town, its needs, its blind spots, its hidden talent. That's when he met RJ, a scrappy 20-something who'd mastered the art of flipping junk. RJ knew every salvage yard in a 50-mile radius. He could turn scrap metal into rent money with one Craigslist post. Glenn saw it instantly. This kid had hustle in his blood. Then there was Dawn, a single mother with 2 kids and a sharp eye for design. She ran a modest but clever side business rehabbing furniture and homes. Her instincts were razor sharp, and her taste was clean, bold, and local savvy. Finally, AJ entered the picture, a quiet giant with the hands of a craftsman and the soul of a chef. AJ didn't just make barbecue, he honored it. The first time Glenn tasted his ribs, he sat in stunned silence. This wasn't food, it was a story. Glenn's instincts sparked. He didn't know exactly what they'd build yet, but these 3, they were underdogs just like him, hungry, humble, and burning to prove themselves. He started to share pieces of his vision, not the full picture. He couldn't reveal the show, the secret, the stakes, but he gave them enough to believe in something bigger, a team, a mission, a long shot worth fighting for. Bit by bit, the ragtag crew came together. They brainstormed. They worked side by side. They argued and laughed and dreamed and broke sweat together. And one idea began to rise from the noise. Something real. Something tangible. They wouldn't just survive. They would build. Together. The idea hit him over a paper plate of ribs. AJ had invited Glenn over one night after a long day of hauling scrap and hustling jobs. The garage was dim, cluttered, and smoky. But the smell in the air? Heavenly. Glenn sat down and took a bite of a slow-cooked, spice-rubbed rib that nearly melted off the bone. The silence that followed said everything. AJ looked up. "You good?" Glenn grinned. "You have no idea." That bite changed the game. It wasn't just a good meal. It was a product. It had flavor, soul, personality. It told a story. And Glenn knew from experience, people don't just buy food, they buy meaning, community, experience, especially in a place like Erie, where grit was currency and every meal mattered. He looked at AJ. "You ever think about opening a restaurant?" AJ laughed. "With what money?" That was the spark. Glenn didn't have money either, but he had the mindset. He'd seen too many good ideas rot from hesitation. This wasn't about what they didn't have. It was about what they did. A vision started forming. They would build something Erie could rally around. Something simple, honest, unapologetically local. A barbecue joint run by underdogs, for underdogs. Glenn scribbled ideas on napkins, name concepts, layout sketches, sauce labels. It all came to him like puzzle pieces, finally snapping together. The next day, he gathered Dawn and RJ. "We're opening a restaurant." They blinked. "In 50 days. RJ choked on his coffee. "You serious?" "As a heart attack," Glenn replied. "We bottle AJ's sauce. We build a pop-up menu. We flip one more house to cover our first investment. Then we find a building. Something we can clean up, paint, fix with our hands. We don't just serve food, we serve a story." Dawn was the first to nod. She saw what he saw, an idea big enough to matter, small enough to execute. They called it Underdog BBQ. The name said it all. None of them were supposed to succeed, not by society's standards. They were broke, unconnected, unknown, but they were fighters, workers, believers. And Erie? Erie was full of people just like them. Within a week, they were in motion. Dawn helped Glenn scout and flip an old run-down house, pocketing just enough profit to get things rolling. RJ helped salvage tables, bar stools, and signs from closed businesses. AJ perfected his signature sauces. Glenn used every ounce of business instinct to negotiate equipment deals, score discounts, and smooth-talk contractors. They found a building, abandoned, filthy, but full of potential. And they got to work. Paint buckets replaced pillows. Blueprints replaced sleep. Music played from tinny speakers while they sanded walls and repaired leaky pipes. Every nail they hammered into the walls was a line in their story. They weren't just building a restaurant. They were building a symbol, a place where anyone who had ever felt counted out could walk in, smell the smoke, and think, maybe I can do it too. They had less than 2 months to pull off the impossible. But Glenn had been here before. This time, he wasn't doing it alone. The space didn't look like much. Just a dusty, abandoned building on Erie's west side with a leaky roof, busted plumbing, and walls yellowed with time. But to Glenn Stearns and his crew, it was sacred ground. It was where they'd make their last stand. Underdog BBQ wasn't just an idea anymore. It was a blueprint tacked to the wall, a truckload of salvaged furniture, a dream stitched into every conversation. With just a few weeks left on the clock, the team had moved from vision to execution. But now came the hardest part, bringing it to life. They worked like maniacs. RJ hustled scrap materials and upcycled tables and chairs. Dawn oversaw design and decor, painting walls and sourcing everything from lighting to silverware on pennies. AJ began smoking meat in a makeshift pit out back, testing recipes and tweaking seasoning until every bite was perfection. And Glenn? He never stopped moving. He negotiated deals for restaurant equipment, bartered for refrigeration units, and pitched his way into last-minute plumbing help. Every setback was another sprint. Every dollar was a game of chess. But it wasn't all triumph. The bathroom flooded. Twice. The fryer shorted out after a faulty install. A crucial inspection was delayed when a permit got misplaced in the city office. And worse, stress started to show. Tempers flared. The crew snapped at each other. Exhaustion made even small things feel like personal attacks. One night, after a 16-hour workday, Glenn walked out behind the building and leaned against the wall, staring up at the sky. His hands were raw, his back screamed, and doubt crept in. What if they didn't make it? What if the building didn't open in time? What if the people didn't show up? He had risked more than his pride. He'd risked the hopes of a group of people who had come to believe in something because he believed in it first. But as he stood there in the dark, AJ appeared beside him, holding out a tray. Brisket, smoked low and slow. "Try this," AJ said. Glenn took a bite. The flavor exploded in his mouth. It was magic. The doubt didn't vanish, but it got quieter. They kept going. 2 weeks out, Glenn pulled his boldest marketing move yet. A free BBQ block party. No menu. No prices. Just smoked meat, music, and an invitation to the community to come see what was brewing inside the mysterious space on the corner. Hundreds showed up, locals, families, old men in lawn chairs, teenagers with curiosity. They ate, laughed, danced, and word started to spread. Something new was coming to Erie, and it smelled like smoke and sauce and second chances. Now, with only days remaining before the official opening, Glenn pushed harder than ever. The final chairs were assembled, the menu was printed, the signage was hung, and on a quiet morning, just before the doors opened, Glenn walked through the dining room alone. Sunlight spilled across the freshly polished floor. The kitchen hummed with anticipation. It was real. It was standing. And nobody, not a soul, knew that the man who'd slept in the truck out back, who'd painted these walls and cleaned these floors, had once owned jets and mansions. All they saw was a man who believed in a town that others had overlooked, and a restaurant that carried their name in spirit. Underdog. The morning air outside Underdog BBQ buzzed with anticipation. Inside, final touches were being made, napkins stacked, sauces stirred, tables polished, until they reflected the lights above. The kitchen was humming, and the dining room smelled like smoke, spice, and something deeper. Victory. Glenn Stearns stood near the back, wearing a black apron streaked with sauce, his hands still stained from prepping ribs. His heart pounded, not from exhaustion, but from what he was about to do. Today wasn't just the grand opening of a restaurant, it was the end of the game. 90 days, $100. No identity, no shortcuts. He looked around at the people who had walked this road beside him. RJ was fiddling with a sign outside, taping up the open banner with care. Dawn was making sure the register was ready, her 2 kids playing quietly in the corner. AJ stood behind the smoker, nodding with quiet confidence as he tended the meat like it was sacred. None of them knew, not one of them knew who Glenn really was. And in minutes, that truth would come out. Customers were already gathering outside. Locals, curious passers-by, friends they'd made along the way, people from the block party who had tasted something and come back, hungry for more. The smell of smoked brisket drifted through the open door. The line grew. The moment had arrived. Glenn walked to the front of the restaurant, wiping his hands on a towel. The team gathered. They looked tired, but proud. Battle-tested. victorious. He cleared his throat. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you all." They looked up. Dawn tilted her head. "I haven't been completely honest." Silence. He took a deep breath. "My name isn't really Glenn Bryant." Eyes narrowed, puzzled looks. AJ folded his arms. RJ blinked. "I came here under a different name because I was part of an experiment, a TV show, and—" The front door burst open. A producer stepped in, camera in hand, nodding. The crew that had been so quiet for months was suddenly front and center. One of the cameramen gave a subtle thumbs up. Glenn turned back to his team. "I'm Glenn Stearns." The words hung in the air. No one moved. No one breathed. Then RJ's jaw dropped. Dawn's eyes filled. AJ's hand went to his chest, stunned. "I'm a businessman, a founder, and yes, I'm a billionaire." He paused, letting it settle, watching their minds race through everything. Every late night, every scraped dollar, every freezing moment they had shared with a man they thought had nothing. He reached into his back pocket, pulled out envelopes, laid them one by one on the table in front of his teammates. No one said a word. Dawn's hands trembled as she opened hers. She gasped. Her knees gave slightly, but she caught herself on the table. A tear rolled down her cheek. Glenn looked at her, and then at each of them. "I came here to prove something," he said, voice shaking. "But in the end, you proved it to me." The front door opened wider. The line of customers stepped in. The team still stood frozen, envelopes in hand. The smell of barbecue filled the air. And from outside, someone shouted, "Hey, are you guys open?" Glenn looked at the crew. He smiled. Then he turned toward the door.